As a result, I hired a private investigator. Over the past month, strange things have started to happen to my wife. She has become different, and our arguments have escalated into loud, ridiculous quarrels. Strangely enough, she didn't seem to notice any changes in herself. Meanwhile, I was up to my neck with my small business, which I had been running for 2 years. It required me to focus, so instead of not delving too deeply into her behavior, I decided it would be easier to hire a private investigator. The investigator wasn't cheap, but he was thorough. He even managed to bug her car and her office. Pretty slick work, I got to say. A couple of days later, I was listening in on a conversation between her and some guy. Turns out, he's her colleague. From their chat, it was clear they'd already hooked up a few times, near the office and even at work. Now, her lover wanted to take things to the next level. A real bed this time. They settled on meeting at a hotel Friday evening. Funny enough, she had told me she was heading out with friends on Saturday. I'd already discovered that this guy was also married, so I wasted no time getting in touch with his wife. We met, and I laid everything out. I told her that if she wanted proof, she should come with me on Saturday night. So we tailed my wife together. We rented a car and parked near the bar. Didn't take long. There she was, stepping out, with her lover close behind. Turns out he was already waiting for her at the bar before we even arrived. His wife was in tears. I told her to focus her energy on getting mad instead of crying. Then I watched them head toward her car, the one I bought for her, by the way, and he hopped in the driver's seat. They drove off to some cheap hotel near the airport. I suggested we wait a little, let them get undressed, and, well, get into it, so we could make sure they were caught red-handed. 5 minutes later, I knocked on the door, shouting, "Open up, security." The lover opens the door, barely holding up a towel. I smiled and said, "Hey there, I'm Avery's husband. You catch my drift." And before he could react, I socked him right in the face. He hit the floor. After that, I gathered up my wife's clothes and dragged the guy out of the room. Literally hauled him outside and tossed him into a snowdrift. It was January, and the snow was deep. His wife lost it completely. She started hitting and kicking him while he was still lying there, stunned. Meanwhile, I went back into the room where my wife was sitting on the bed, trembling. She muttered, "You shouldn't have known." That line lit a fire in me, and I yanked her out of the room, dragging her all the way to the parking lot. I pulled out my phone and started recording. She was shaking, admitting everything she'd done. I told her no one would ever forgive her after this. Then, without a second thought, I dialed her dad's number. As soon as she realized what I was doing, she screamed, "No, no, no." I told her father what had happened. His response, a cold, simple "I'm disgusted with her" before he hung up. She was screaming, wailing, like her whole world had just collapsed. I threw her clothes at her, told her to get dressed. She kept trembling, unable to stop. Once she was dressed, I called a taxi, shoved her into the back seat, and sent her off to her sister's place. After that, I got into her car. Well, technically mine, since I'm the one who bought it for her. As for her lover and his wife, they drove off in the rental. Come Monday, I called her boss. I told him everything about his 2 employees and threw in that if they kept working there, I'd be filing a lawsuit. Total bluff, of course, but I hinted that I had some good connections at the bar and in court. That did the trick. He fired both of them. Afterward, I packed up my wife's things and dropped them off at her sister's. It took a couple more days for the shock to wear off. Eventually, she tried calling me, but I wasn't interested in talking. This back and forth lasted a few weeks until her sister called, saying my wife had lost it. She'd stopped eating, wasn't speaking, just slipping further into a dark place. I told her sister to call for an ambulance. Long story short, my wife ended up in a psychiatric hospital under observation. A while later, the hospital called, and they scheduled a meeting with me. I wasn't exactly eager to go, But I showed up. At the meeting, I was told that my wife fully understood what she had done. Apparently, the way I handled things, especially forcing her to confess while half-naked in public, had shocked her so badly that it triggered a mental breakdown. The psychiatrist said she'd experienced a major nervous collapse, which contributed to some sort of personality split. Still, they reassured me that with time, she'd probably recover. I just stared at them and said, well, she treated me like garbage before I caught her, so I'm not too sure her personality was all that great to begin with. When I left, they said they would call me back next week. Of course, we met again next week. She looked completely shattered, like the ghost of who she once was. My wife used to do figure skating. She had a toned, attractive figure, but in just a few weeks, she lost at least 10 kilograms. She tried to justify everything by saying that she was cheating on me only because I was too focused on work, and she was just trying to hide it from me. I dismissed it as nonsense, reminding her of how many times she complained about the lack of money, which in the first place pushed me to develop a business. I told her that she was still scaring me. I couldn't be with her anymore. I want a divorce, I said. That's when her doctor nearly threw me out of the room. We got into a shouting match, and suddenly, she interrupted. Okay, yes, I was selfish. I wanted to feel romance again, the thrill of something new. I wanted to know what cheating felt like. Finally, she admitted a bit of truth. The therapist left us alone after that. I asked her to think about what it had all been for. The affair was long behind us now, but look where it had led. Her parents were ashamed of her. She'd lost her job, and fixing things would require a huge effort, not to mention an enormous amount of time. She begged me not to leave, said she didn't know how she'd survive without me. But I didn't say a word. At that point, I was still in touch with her lover's wife. They were still living together, under the same roof. One day, I asked her to meet up, suggesting we share a bottle of wine. She hesitated, reminding me that she was still married. I laughed and replied, technically, so am I, but that didn't stop our spouses from having their fun, so why should it stop us? We met up. After some small talk, I leaned in, half joking, and said, you know, it'd probably be poetic justice if we became lovers too. I expected her to politely turn me down, but to my surprise, she smiled and said, just don't take me to that cheap hotel. We ended up booking a beautiful room and spent the next 3 days together, getting to know each other. This continued for about 2 months while I figured out my next move. To be honest, the anger eventually faded, and I thought about just leaving everything behind and going back to how things were, but something kept gnawing at me. In the end, I decided to get a divorce anyway. 2 years have passed since then, and now, looking back, I'm grateful for everything that happened. It's only now that I've come to understand what real life feels like. And honestly, I wish you the same.